Could I introduce, please, our first speaker for this next session? And Melinda is someone who's inspired me in our work in our association. Melinda's a social worker and really has an interest in working with children and families affected by M&D, which is something following our ice bucket money that we've invested in. So please welcome Melinda Kavanaugh.
Thank you all so much. This has been a phenomenal meeting. I am here to talk about some resource manuals or guides that I have had the great privilege to create with the ALS Association here in the United States, along with several really fantastic chapters across the US. So, why family materials? One of the things that I have been incredibly fortunate to do over the years is conduct a lot of research around ALS, motor neuron disease, in families. So what are their experiences? Particularly, what are the experiences of children in these families? One area that I am very focused on is the role that children play as caregivers to a family member with ALS motor neuron. And one of the things that we realize is that we don't have a full understanding of how many families are in the US living with ALS. What exactly are their needs? What are some of the resources that we can provide from them? And one of the ways that we've been able to start answering these questions is through several studies that I've conducted on families in ALS. So we've done interviews with 101 adults who are living with ALS and 57 of their children who are living in the family and providing care for this individual with ALS. And one of the things that came out of these interviews were the parents and the individuals living with ALS saying, I really want to be able to talk to my children, but I don't know exactly what to say. I don't want them to know that I'm scared. And I don't want them to have to think about it. There's a large idea or feeling of protecting your children in these families. I don't want them to be exposed. I don't want them to be concerned. But the truth is, the children are involved. They're there. They're in the families. They're experiencing it. And one of the things that the children frequently say is, well, we aren't talking about it, but I really wish we would. But I don't really know what to ask. They also say things like, well, I think I know what ALS is, but I don't really know. And that's a huge issue in all of these interviews, asking children, what do you even know about this disease? What does it do? How do you talk about it as a family? And one of the things that came out so clearly in these interviews were the barriers to communication, the lack of communication, the miscommunication. And so in meetings with several chapters around the US and with the national office, we looked at what are some ways that we can start helping families have these conversations. Because really it comes down to starting the conversation. I was just talking to some folks earlier about we don't want to tell people exactly what to say or how to say it, but we want to give them the tools to start these talks and to feel comfortable to have these discussions. And we know that children and families are dealing with not just ALS as a disease, but children are dealing with school and their friends, and they feel weird about it. And how do they talk to their friends? What about issues around death and dying? You know, we as a society do a terrible job of talking about death and dying. And then you drill it down to families who are living with it on a daily basis, and it doesn't necessarily make it any easier. So I looked to all the different resources that we had here in the United States for children and families living with ALS. And the resources, there were some fantastic ones, but they were very inconsistent across our chapters. We have over 40 chapters. there's people from the ALSA who's probably going to correct me, somewhere around there, chapters here in the US. And there were very few printed materials that families could access uniformly across the US. And so what came out was we really needed to create something that was available to everybody and that was guided by research and by clinical practice. So what I mean by that is all of these interviews with these families, they're telling us very clearly what they do and don't know, how they want to know it, and what ways we can support them. And also clinical practice, and not just the clinical practice experienced on a daily basis by our chapters, but also the feedback they get from the families in their clinics and in their daily work. And I'm a research professor, but I'm also a licensed clinical social worker, and I've spent all of my practice years working with families in complex neurological disorders. So we put all of these things together, and we developed a guide for families and ALS. And this guide was very much a product of a collaborative work, again, with various chapters, with the national organization, and with myself and my university. So we used data from the ALS survey. We inserted lots of different frequently asked questions, and those will come up in the different chapters as I talk about them. And one of the things that was very intentional is that I used a child development perspective. So we know that when we are talking about something massive and something really very overwhelming like ALS or death or dying, we need to understand the age and the developmental stage of the child and how do we structure those conversations. So all of that is embedded in this resource guide. And the first thing we wanted to address was just talking about ALS. What we found is that families just aren't, for a variety of different reasons. They're just not having sit-down conversations. And this quote is from a youth who said, I want more information. Like, as things start to progress, I don't know if I'm gonna know what to do. So here's this kid living in this home, in this family with ALS, and they don't really know what's happening because the family isn't talking about it. And so in this chapter, we spend a lot of time talking about how do you prepare for that discussion? You know, how do you steel yourself for it? That it's not about, I'm gonna sit down, I'm gonna tell my kid everything right now. No, it's about piecemeal, starting it, putting it out there, having that conversation when you're already doing quote unquote normal things, just asking simple questions here and there to ease that transition and to make it a normal part of your discussion. Also, this is a chapter where we put lots of discussions by age group, understanding that younger children are going to understand things in a very different, very concrete way, as opposed to older children that can grasp more complex, hypothetical, kind of the what-ifs. So then the next chapter, we talked about caregiving. And this is an area that's obviously a research area of mine, but it's an area I was just talking with some folks a minute ago, again, about the lack of attention paid. And part of the reason why we don't talk about children as caregivers is because families are often very uncomfortable to share that information. So whether it's because they think it's a sign of abuse or neglect, they're going to be judged. There's a certain amount of stigma, but the reality is there are costs associated with care, and particularly in countries like the United States where we're in a total state of flux with our health care. Who do we rely on? We rely on the family caregiver. Well, when the other adult in the home is having to work, that family caregiver often by proxy becomes the child in the home. So I wanted to put this chapter in here so that families could talk about it in a way that lessens the stigma and shame that they feel, because there's no reason for them to be feeling that. We wanted to give them the comfort of, here are some conversation starters. We also gave a little bit of background. Like, what are the kinds of things that kids are doing? And here's just a brief list. And, you know, sometimes people look at that list and think, oh, well, maybe they do one or two. We have children across the U.S. and really across the world. I do a lot of research now with South Africa as well, and kids are doing every single one of these items. And so we have a chapter where, how do you talk about it? Like, how do you even bring this conversation up? We also encourage families to be really open with their children, that letting them know, it makes them feel a little awkward too. It can't necessarily be fun to have your 10-year-old bathe you, but to be able to talk about it in a comfortable way, to let them know, this is something that I need and you're caring for me. How can we talk about it? How can we make it part of our discussion? We also spend a good deal of time talking about training and education. One of the areas that I've been spending a lot of research time on now is over 60% of the children in all of my studies have no guidance, training, or education, and yet they're participating in an overwhelming amount of caregiving. And I've been working with the ALS Association for a little over a year now, with the Colorado chapter, the Wisconsin chapter, and now the St. Louis chapter, to develop a training and education protocol for children. Support. So kids tell us all the time they need support. They need people to talk to. They need to be heard. And one of the places that they typically get support is at school and with their friends. So we've written a full chapter on how to engage the school. And one of the key things that the children tell us in these surveys, in these interviews, and the parents tell us is that they want to make sure the kids are really involved in this discussion. Because you don't want to blindside the child and say, oh, by the way, I just talked to your teacher and your counselor and your principal, and everybody knows what's going on with you, and they're all going to hover over you and make sure that you're okay. And kids tell us that really freaks them out, that they want to be a part of every step of the conversation. And some kids say, you know what, school is my safe space. School is my place where I don't have to think about it all the time. School is my place where I get to actually be a kid. So you want to be very sensitive with having these conversations with school, including the child. And again, all of these chapters use quotes and use data from both the study, from other research, to really give it some strength and some evidence-based to this resource guide. I just had this conversation. This is a very recent addition to this. A young woman who is part of our Wisconsin chapter. So I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and work very closely with the Wisconsin chapter. Her father recently passed away. And I was talking with her mother about this talk, and I was talking with her mother about the guide. And her daughter wanted to add something. And so this was her piece to say, this is what happened and this is what it felt like when my father passed away. And one of the things that jumps out at me, if you'll see at the end, that she sat in the bedroom with her dog, who was extremely confused. So she felt that she needed to explain it in that her dog was the confused one. But in the end, it really was her, because there wasn't discussion around grief and loss and death and dying. And again, very difficult conversations to have. The St. Louis chapter did a phenomenal job numerous years ago putting together some talking points about grief and loss and death and dying across different age groups. And we put that in this manual here so that families could have a really broad understanding of how to have these very difficult conversations. I see Steve lurking over my shoulder. I want to get to the end quickly. So professional resources. We have a full chapter in this guide for folks like you. So we detail the different programs that chapters across the U.S. have conducted over the years, and some of them are just phenomenal. Educational programs and backpack programs and respite and camps and support groups, so that as you are working with your families to go through this guide and say, here's a support for you, we didn't want to leave out all of you all in the room, all of the practitioners and all of the professionals saying, how do we go about supporting these kids and these families? And the last thing I want to add, this picture here was actually drawn by the young woman that I just referenced a moment ago. This is her and with an umbrella, and you can't tell, but all of the raindrops are all of her thoughts and feelings about having a dad with ALS. It's quite profound. Caregiving is in there, fear, anger, scared, happy, worried. And one of the next steps for us is we're working on guides for children. So the first guide that I just spent all this time was for the family. So it really was presented to the parent, to the family, to the professional. These are new guides that are actually in later stages of being completed. We have a graphic novel that will be for young children between the ages of 7 and 11. And again, it uses all of the data from the different interviews and the different research projects. Then we also have a Choose Your Own Adventure book. I don't know if you guys were really big on those, but when I was like 12, that was the best thing ever. So basically, it's a choose your own adventure in a choose your own discussion. So it lays out multiple case studies of kids that I've worked with over the years, and it gives different options about, if you talk to this person, what might you say? If you talk to this person, what might you say? So it gives a lot of buy-in for these kids. And then the young adult book is created for young adults up to around 25 or 26-ish, and really engages some of the issues around school, trying to become their own adult when they're caring for a parent, and also relationships. So that's that. I want to say a huge thank you to the chapters and the national office and the families. They gave a tremendous amount to these resource guides. So thank you.
Thanks, Melinda. And I just want to take a chair's privilege, because as Melinda knows, that child you're talking about was me through my teenage years, as a young carer and as a single child, and doing all that, and it means so much to me to see that we do this within MND and ALS, so thank you. Okay, we have time for maybe a couple of questions, so please raise your hand. Yeah, okay.
Good morning, excellent work. Rebecca Axline from Houston, Texas. I'm a social worker as well.
Yay.
And I'm sure your research is wonderful. I don't see that experience in our clinic. Our families hunger for information for the children. They're always asking. I've been piecemealing a lot of it together, so I'm really excited about you bringing this for all of us to use. I hope that at some point there's going to be some discussion or connection with social networking as well, because what I hear from the children is they don't want to come to support groups, they don't want to read a book, they want to interact, and yet the families, as we've discussed, are a little bit leery of that, giving up that freedom to speak, whether it's through webinars or some kind of protected Facebook, and also developing that. And the only other one thing I just want to say is, out of Austin, Texas, I've been trying to partner with a group called Wonders and Worries. They're child life specialists.
Yes.
And funded by the Livestrong. And so I would love that to be on the resource list as well. So.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. Yes, to your first comment, families experience everything, right? Good, bad, ugly with this. So I thank you for that. The social media piece, absolutely. As we've been doing these kind of training and education protocols across the U.S., the biggest thing is that at the end, the kids are sharing their information, the families are sharing their information, they're exchanging email and Facebook, and so it's definitely a piece of it. This is available online through the ALS Association. You can download it. You can also order a copy of it. And then all of the youth guides that are are going to be coming up will also be available online and in hard copy. And the next step is also to be working on web-based supports and services. So right on.
Okay, thank you. And join with me again in thanking Melinda for her presentation. Thank you.